Our topic this evening is finding your spiritual path. And a lot of times, when we ask questions, we find the answers harder to find because the question isn't phrased exactly correctly. Sometimes when we're very confused, we are simply asking the wrong question. This is a different topic than we're talking about tonight, but when I've talked about how to get intuitive guidance, how to pray so that you will get an answer, a great deal of the time when we're not feeling inward intuition, or we're absolutely certain that God has gone down or has another job in another place and is not listening to us, it's not really that there's no wish from a higher level to speak to us. It's rather that the question we're asking has no divine answer. Because often we think that the issue is where I live, who I live with, what profession I follow, all of the everyday issues that occupy us. And so we want our own superconscious, if you think of it that way, or God himself or herself to answer us. But God doesn't really have an opinion on where you live and who you live with and what profession you follow, because the only thing that our higher self really wants from us is that we learn how to open our hearts, that we be courageous in our service and in our giving. So when we ask the question, how can I love more? How can I serve more? How can I overcome the fears that limit me? Then we're asking questions for which there are divine answers. So what we're talking about today, how do I find my spiritual path? And you come up here and it's set up with these pictures of these particular teachers, these particular gurus. I'm not quite sure how the advertising for this event went, but I'm on a longer tour and I'm holding Autobiography of a Yogi in lots of the pictures, which is the seminal book for awakening consciousness now in our age. It's really, if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do. But I'm not at all here to collect disciples for the masters, and less even absurdly not for myself. What we're here to is to awaken the power of the Spirit within each person, so that Spirit can then guide each one of us in an upward way. Much of the time we live what is quite simply called an unexamined life, which is whatever circumstance we find ourselves born into, whatever ethnicity, whatever race, whatever cultural context, language, and we have elders around us, parents and others, who have made their decisions about life, and then they try to give them to us. And sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. And the difficulty is not in the specific ways that life is offered to us, but whether or not we have the creativity, the energy, and in some cases the courage to really attune ourselves to why I was born. Why am I here? Who am I? And even more profoundly, when Paramhansa Yogananda, who was born in Calcutta, who was a Bengali from India, and trained with his own guru, this is the lineage of gurus, his own guru, Sri Yukteswar. This is Yogananda, if you don't know. Yogananda here and Sri Yukteswar, his guru. And at a certain point when Yogananda was in his mid-20s, 25, 26 years old, he was called to leave India and go to America. And that year was 1920. And now, where I live in Silicon Valley in California. So there are actually more Indians than there are anyone else there. When I was in Delhi, India, and my friend took me to Starbucks, which of course is now well established all over the world, Starbucks coffee shop, I go in and I see many young techie-minded Indians with their Apple computers sitting around the tables drinking Starbucks coffee. And I thought I was across the street from the temple that we have in Palo Alto, because that's exactly what it looks like in there. But when Yogananda came in 1920, he was extraordinarily exotic. And he had long hair, and he dressed in orange robes, and he would be exotic in any setting because he was so dynamic. When he came out to lecture, he said, he would come out and he would say, "How is everyone? How feels everyone?" And he would train them to say, "Awake and ready," like this. And then he would say it again, "And how is everyone?" And they would say, "Awake and ready." And he would just magnetize them. And he did. Not only did he have the power of the Spirit behind him, but he had mastery over many elements of the material world that no one had mastery over. He would literally, "Are there any doctors in the house?" And he would have the doctors come up. He would have them take his pulse. He would have no pulse in one side, a rapid pulse in the other. No pulse in this side, a slow pulse in this side. And he would stretch himself out with just the tip of his head and his heels on a chair like that. And then he would have heavy people try to bounce on him and dislodge him. So he was a phenomenon. You can well imagine. Thousands of people came to see him. He went back and forth across the United States, filling the biggest halls that there were, all in the early 1920s, just completely outside anything anybody had ever seen. But he didn't really come to make a circus. He just used the power he had to get the attention of the world, because he was sent on a mission from the ancient masters to awaken those who could be awakened. So, one of the powerful prayers that he uttered that we in our communities reiterate, "May thy love shine forever, may the divine love shine forever on the sanctuary of devotion, which is my own heart, and then may I be able to awaken that love in all hearts." Because once that love is there, once we begin to understand that life is not what it seems, that it's just, there's so much more on so many more levels happening, and once that, even a seed of that begins to open within us, then everything becomes different after that. So when we're talking about a spiritual path, we may be talking also about following certain masters, and there's very good reason for a person to do that, because, well, let's put it in simple words, because we need help. That's why. Because when you meet someone who has the foggiest idea what's going on beyond the obvious, then some tremendous different potential happens for you. I started studying the idea of self-realization, which is to say self with a capital S, to realize who I really am. You know, that's a small s and the capital S. All of us have a sense of self, every one of us. I've always been me. Sometimes I find this terrifying, but nonetheless, we all have it. We have a tiny baby in the room, 3 months old. She already has a name. She has her family, and she will, from her first understanding, she will always be herself. But then a certain question comes to all of us, which is what is really going on here. I remember my earliest memories were all associated with this strange dual reality. When I was when I was small enough to be able to curl up on the one side of the floor of the backseat of a car, and there were no seat belts when I was a child, and the cars had this big hump in the middle. I don't know enough about anything to know what that is. I know they just don't have it anymore. But as little children, 3 of us, my sister wasn't born, so there were 2 of us at that point. We'd be in the back seat, and for those of you who raise children, you know what happens when you put 2 small children in the back seat, especially when one of them is an older brother who loves to tease his little sister. Mayhem ensues. So there was mayhem in the back seat, and my parents were wonderful and very fair, but my mother turned back and sternly scolded both of us. And it hurt my feelings. I think I was naughty, so I didn't feel like I was mistreated, but I didn't like being scolded by my mother. And I curled up on the floor, and I put my head on the round thing like this so I could hear the tires. I was, as I said earlier to some of you, I was a Jewish family from Texas, and believe me, we'd never heard of the word Om before. It just wasn't part of our vocabulary. But I listened, and I felt the rhythm of that, and I felt that sound just filling me. I mean, decades later, I learned it's a very well-known meditation technique to just sit and listen to the Om, not necessarily on the floor of the backseat of a car, but the sound just went like that. And here's the part. I knew, and I was consciously trying to accomplish this, I knew that I existed on 2 levels. And on one level, when my mother scolded me, my feelings were hurt. On another level, nothing that ever happened in this world could ever touch me. That my actual state, my actual self, was perfectly happy and perfectly free. Oh, I've come deeply to believe in reincarnation, and the only way I could have known that at the age of 2 was that I had learned it before, and looking at the trajectory of my life, there's really no other explanation, except I just picked up the story wherever it left off, wherever that might have been. But even that young, because it's inherent within us, children are incompetent in terms of the world. They can't speak, they can't read, they can't run machines. They can go on the internet, though, from a very small age. But anyway, but they know, because consciousness, the age of the body does not determine consciousness. And so my consciousness was completely intact. And I was convinced that the adults around me had some great, and I didn't have the word, but metaphysical secret, that they knew the meaning of life. And perhaps when I got to a certain age, in the Jewish tradition, at the age of 13, 12 or 13, boys are bar mitzvahed and girls can be bat mitzvahed if they choose. I never was. But I figured maybe as part of that whole ritual, then the adults all take the children into a room and they say, ha ha, good joke, and here's the real meaning of life. Here's what you're really doing here. But that didn't happen. And the older I got, and the more I realized that the wonderful adults around me, and I was very blessed in that respect, they didn't know either. They were just taking life as it came, raising their children, getting a house, getting a job, putting a little money away, and they did it beautifully. But I just looked at it, and I thought, this cannot be it. Really, I was absolutely desperate. And you can see I have a facility with words. I was school smart. And if you're school smart, everybody thinks you got it made. So I was school smart. I had opportunities. And every single one I looked at, this is how it felt to me. And I could somehow see the end of it. I should add, I had a very profound experience when I was about 18. And I feel like, quote, I was awake all night, whether I actually was or not, but that's how it felt. And somehow, even though I was young and healthy, I just was at the hour of my death in my imagination. And I was just lying on my deathbed. At that time, I didn't even know anybody who died. Since then, because of the position I'm in the community, I've actually been with a number of people, literally, when they breathe their last. And it was interesting that my 18-year-old picture of it was pretty much exactly the way I've seen it act out, which is I knew that no matter how many people loved me, no matter how much money I made, no matter how successful I was, any of those things, death would come. I don't find death to be a frightening or a morbid subject. I think it's a marvelous part of the story, and we ignore it at our peril. Not because we should think about dying, but we have to realize how temporary this experience is and how much we accumulate. Absolutely nothing of it can go with you. There was a wonderful cartoon I read where the man goes to the psychic reader to find out who he will be in his next lifetime so he can will his fortune to that person. Very clever. I actually think there's an insurance company. I actually read about this, an insurance company to whom you give secret codes. And then when you come back reincarnated, you'll be able to get your own money back. I don't know if they're still in business, but it's brilliant. It's a brilliant scheme. I don't know if there are any laws against it. Why not try it? But in my world, I was lying there and I just projected myself into my departure. And I realized no matter how many people loved me, no matter how much I was never interested in money, that my family was not that way. But of course, money is helpful. But just no matter what I did, there would come a moment when I would have nothing except my consciousness. That I would simply be who I had become, and everything else would be incidental. And I didn't have it clear. Now I have it very clear, the metaphysics and the philosophy of it all. I can explain it all. But I still knew it. I just knew. And everything I felt had to be measured against that. What kind of good could I do in this world? Who could I become? And this is where, nobody talked to me about that. And fortunately, I found books. And so for 3 years, I read books. And I read about every individual spiritual person I could find. That was before the internet. You had to go to a bookstore, and there happened to be a really good one right where I lived. I just started reading through the saints and masters and yogis section like this. And I read about Catholic saints. That was hard because I was Jewish. I read about Protestant missionaries. That was hard because I just didn't really want to live in the bush somewhere. That just didn't attract me. I read about yogis living in caves. That didn't really feel like my lifestyle either. I just couldn't figure out how I was going to take an idea and make it a life. And then, because God is merciful, I was at Stanford University. I actually attended briefly, but I dropped out of college because it didn't tell me anything I wanted to know. But I was there again, and Swami Kriyananda, who was 44 years old at that point, American, but had lived in India, the disciple of an Indian master. And he walked in, and the room was about this big. And he came and he just stood right here in his orange robes. He didn't say a word. How did I know? I don't know how I knew. But he walked in. I said, "He has what I want." Those are the words. I didn't even know what it was. But I could see that he had turned ideas into an actual way of life. And that was it. I never looked back, and I've never regretted it for 1 minute. It was the best decision I ever made. That's it. He has what I want. Later, I left what I was living in San Francisco. I was working as the kind of job you get if you have no particular education, but you can talk. So I had a job like that. I got fired from one of those jobs first because I didn't give a damn. That's the only word I can think of saying. I thought I was doing well, but my boss was smarter than I was. So the next job I covered up a little bit. So I left that, and when I was in Bangalore, India, talking to a group of people I just met, and I said, so I just left everything and went to live in this community that Kriyananda had started up in the mountains. And we were dirt poor. We had just nothing, and we loved it. It was absolutely fantastic. But I was telling this group in Bangalore, and one of them said, "It's a natural end. What did your parents think?" I said, "I never asked them." And even more than that, I said, "It never crossed my mind to ask them." Now, partly we're American, and we're pretty cavalier. I don't think we're appropriate sometimes, but we're pretty cavalier sometimes about family. But also, it never crossed my mind to ask, because whether they approved or not, what difference did it make? Okay? I'm actually talking about the spiritual path. This is what the spiritual path is. When it gets bigger, when something is bigger than all your other considerations, and it comes into you like a fire, if you're lucky, or at least like a candle, or maybe like the torch on your cell phone, just something. There's something that's pulsing within you that's saying, I must, I have to, I need to know, I can't go another day. I remember just before I met Swami Kriyananda, when I was reading all these books, but I was still, as I described it to myself, getting up in the morning, going to work, coming home at night, spending time with my friends, going to bed, getting up the next morning, going to work, coming home at night, everybody has what we call samskars, impressions from the past. My samskars have to do with mental unbalance. Maybe that's not an attractive thing to say. I don't think I'm unbalanced now, but in the past, more than physical ailments, I've had mental moments. I remember standing in this San Francisco apartment that I was living in, which had a nice view of a little garden behind it. And I was just thinking about the unbearable issue of how to have a meaningful life. I had a compelling desire to help people. I just really wanted to help people, but I was so ignorant, I had nothing to give. And that was agonizing. I didn't know what wisdom was, so I could pass along the bits and pieces that I had accumulated. And then also just the fact that I would always be myself, that I would always be conscious, and I'd already had the vision of dying. All of that was there. And so I thought, standing in the window, maybe I'll have a nervous breakdown. That would be a good idea. And then I had this picture of, the people around me realizing that I had gone off the center. And then they would call in medical people, and they would take me away, and they would take me to a psychiatric hospital, and we would spend a long time, and we would talk, and they would give me drugs, and gradually I would come back to balance, and then they would eventually take me home, and I'd be standing at the window wondering what to do with my life. And I thought, that's a lot of time and effort and money. I don't think I'll waste it. I think it was, now I understand, it was a past life memory, because this is something that Yogananda says, we all try out everything before we realize that the project is to transform my own consciousness. But when the project is to transform my own consciousness, nobody is responsible anymore for my success, my failure, my happiness, my unhappiness. All possibility that it's someone else's fault goes away. And that's a lot to carry. So we're going to explore to see if there's any other option before we take this one. And I could feel it in myself. Well, I've tried a lot of things. Money, success, sensuality, power, madness. It's all just part of the same. Isn't there another option? But at a certain point, we just know there's not. And if we're fortunate, books or people come into our lives and give us a picture of how this is really done. You see, that was what happened when I saw Swami Kriyananda. That has happened to a lot of people when they find autobiography of a yogi. or however it comes to you. Again, this is like all paths, all true paths lead to the same goal. It's different roads up the mountain. You can come to one location from many different places, but you're all going to the same place. But something happens, and then someone comes. And they either come, as I say, through a written book, through a piece of music, through an individual that you meet. And so I met Swami Kriyananda, and there he was. And in addition, he had this community. So it wasn't only that I could learn from him, but I could actually change my life, which is fortunately I was able to do. Part of Yogananda's mission to the world is the idea of people living in intentional communities where what unifies you is not that you're on a river where commerce can happen, but that you share ideals, that the principles that you live by are shared principles, and that this is the true family beyond biology. Biological families may also share ideals, but not necessarily. But your spiritual family, which often goes many different lifetimes, that this is what we're doing, but we're united by one reality. I want to wake up. I want to know what's true, and I'm willing to put out energy to make that happen. Because, see, that's the other thing that happens. Once we have the idea that, oops, there's a lot going on around me all of a sudden. Isn't it interesting that even mechanical things that we've been depending on, that we just think are part of the natural order, as I understand it here, the electricity is going on and off. Yeah. And all of a sudden we think everything that we just could always depend on isn't there. I mean, your country's had a tumultuous history, so you know that. The USA is just beginning to have a tumultuous history, so as I was saying last night, you all are a little ahead of us in all of that, but yeah, nothing that we could depend on. Are we okay now? Thank you. Master Oneness, I call Yogananda Master. He realized that in the day and age that we're living in, like-minded people need to gather together, because it's pretty easy to see this is a pretty heterogeneous world that we have right now, don't we? We have a lot of really nice people, and this is how Kriyananda put it, Swamiji put it. He said, in most of the times, the population of the world is shaped like a cigar, which is very, very fat in the middle, kind of skinny at both ends. And when times are predictable and relatively peaceful, and when technology had not advanced to the point where weapons of mass destruction have become part of our way of thinking, people could just kind of hang out in the middle. Not particularly good, not particularly bad, pretty predictable. I grow up, I find somebody, I'm married, we stay married, we raise children, we live where my parents have lived, we live in the house I was born in, these are my family lands. And you could pretty much just rely on that. It had its weak points, it had its positive. And then there's a few bad people over here, and then there's a few really good people over here, but mostly we're just hanging out in the middle like this. What's happening to us now, and there's fascinating reasons why all that's true, we're really moving into another age. 100 years ago, that which we consider to be absolutely normal didn't even exist. It wasn't even anybody's imagination. You know, the fact that it did take us 21 hours to get here from San Francisco, but look at us, we're here, you know? It would have taken us months to get here before. And immediately I can communicate with my housemate who shows me what he's making for dinner, you know? And I talk to him about, you know, the room that I'm in. I could show him pictures of where I am now. Just boom, just like that. 100 years ago, it would have been considered witchcraft to be able to do that, right? But with all this increased energy, we are still living in a very heterogeneous population. So everything has more energy. So now it's sort of shaped like a dumbbell. There's not a lot of space in the middle. It's really fat in the edges and skinny in the middle. Two big weights on either end and just a little bar connecting them. And people, because of the increased energy, people are, even people, and I don't mean that they're necessarily evil, But the influences on people right now are dragging people down. Music is extremely sensual, very egoic. Movies, television, it's just what would have been considered pornographic and just absolutely not allowed. You can just click the button. I don't click the button, but a person can click the button, and there it is. And as a result, on the other side, there are vast numbers of people, and the wonderful phrase, which is not original with me, light workers, who are people who are trying to increase the light because the contrast is so intense. This is a wonderful time to be living because we're simply not allowed to drift. And we might not always think of it as such a wonderful time, but it is. But a spiritual path is a path that leads us increasingly towards spirit. And how do we find what's right for us? Well, the first and foremost voice we have to listen to is what our heart tells us. What are we drawn to? What inspires us? You know, nowadays you can just, again, use the internet and find every teacher that ever lived, and many who are not living now. You can read and find out all about them, and you feel who resonates with you. But there's something even more important, because it's not possible to gauge a consciousness that's too far beyond our own. You know, you can't. People have discussions about who is fully realized and who is partially realized and who's semi-enlightened and all of this, but speaking for myself, I don't know what I'm talking about. I really don't. I could talk about God-realized masters, but these are directional words that I can use, not anything I can actually see. So one of the ways that we decide which pathway to spirit that we want to walk is by the people you see who are doing it. Do you like them? Are they people that you would like to be like? When I saw Swami Kriyananda, I just wanted to be what he was. He has what I want. That was how my heart spoke to me. It spoke to me in words because I like words. And it spoke to me in words. He has what I want. Later, I began to understand what it was. As I said, I was this distance from him. I recognized him and made the decision before he spoke. And then after he spoke, to this day, I don't remember anything he said, except that I found out he was a disciple of Yogananda. To be honest with you, I had Yogananda's autobiography, but I was very intellectual in my spiritual study, so I liked Vivekananda more than others. He was a very brilliant intellect, also a devotee, but he used a lot of big words, and I like that. And Swamiji spoke, and I heard, all I thought was, he's the most intelligent man I've ever met. But he was a disciple of Yogananda. I had the autobiography of a yogi, but it's full of miracles, and it's full of devotion. And I got to about page 9 when Lahiri Mahashaya, this guru, materializes in a wheat field to correct Yogananda's father on a mistake he was making. It's page 9. And I just thought, I don't think so. And I just put it away. Then I met Swami Kriyananda. I was so magnetized to him, I figured if he likes Yogananda, there's probably something there that I'm not picking up. So I had the book on my shelf. I didn't have to buy it. I just took it down, I started again, and what do you know, I loved it. All the stuff that had bothered me before, now it all just made perfect sense to me. You can't explain that by any kind of intellectual story, but I suddenly understood where I was going and what I was looking for. So the adventure on your spiritual path, whatever path you're following, whatever it might be, is the adventure of trusting yourself, of paying attention to what's really important, and then having the nerve to move on it. I had an actual dilemma, odd as it was, because I had become quite devoted to Sri Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna was an avatar who lived in India. He died in the late 1800s. It was his disciple Vivekananda whose teachings I love so much. And I felt very, very grateful and devoted to that lineage there. And then all of a sudden I'm here with Kriyananda, and it's a different lineage. So you have all this, who is my guru kind of question. But I realized I did not have the equipment to make that decision because it was too subtle a decision. And also, I just, I can theoretically know what all this means, but not really. But this is what I realized. I could sit here on the fence and wait to have clarity. But if I don't have clarity because I don't have sufficiently evolved intuition, I will not develop intuition by sitting on the fence and waiting. So I said, this looks like a good way for me to go. I have this incredible draw to Kriyananda. I'll just step into it, and I'll live as if I were certain. And then I said quite simply, Yogananda, Sri Ramakrishna, this is your problem, not mine. And then I never thought about it. I just did what was in front of me to do. I learned to meditate. I developed a spiritual practice. I started living with spiritual people. I found a way to serve. I started cooking. I wanted to help people. I didn't know much. Actually, I didn't know how to cook either, but it was really tough on the people who had to eat what I cooked. It was really tough. I was a food fanatic, so if it was healthy, it must taste good. And Swami said to me later, you were so caught in your mental concepts, you couldn't tell how awful the food you were making was. And we were living in the community situation where everybody had to eat in the kitchen that I was running. And there was a revolt. They all went to Swamiji and said, you've got to do something, we just can't put up with this anymore. And he said, by that point, I'd begun to realize that there was something off. And Swamiji's way was, if he wanted to correct you, he would start slow. Because if you weren't ready to be corrected, there was no point in correcting you. It had to come out of you. So by that point, so he started slow, and he said something like, lunch that you cooked today was a little bland, is the word he used. I said, yes, sir, I know, I tried, I don't know what happened. He said, in fact, a lot of what you cook is a little bland. Yes, sir, I know. So he said, I'll teach you to cook. And just to finish, I'm on this one, I'll just finish it. This is such an odd story, I don't usually share it, but here I am. So as it happened, this Swami from India was visiting us, and he was a portly gentleman, and he was an enthusiastic trencherman. He really liked his meals. And he was visiting for 3 days. And so I and another woman and a couple of other men were sort of hosting him. And Swamiji himself is a very good cook. And so we started cooking together. I was so intellectual. I thought you learned just through your brain. So I arrived with a notebook and a pen like this. Swami was a little of this and a little of that. And if there's too much of this, I'll balance it with this. And, this kind of cook. And I'm trying to take notes. How do you take notes? Like this. And finally, I just gave up and I put my pen down. And then basically, I washed dishes and occasionally cut a vegetable for like 3 days. And on the last day, we decided if food was a big conversation with this wonderful man. So we decided we would have, not Swamiji, the visitor, we decided we'd have fruit salad. And the woman who was also there, her name was Seva. She said, oh, I'll fix it. And Swami said, fine. And then he stopped her and he said, in a very exaggerated way, no, I'm teaching Asha to cook. So he took me up to the kitchen. I, chopped a few apples, put them into the fruit salad. Monday morning I woke up, I was an excellent cook. I have no idea to this day what happened, except these are the only things I can think of. I had to stop using my brain. I had to open myself to another energy. And also, very interestingly, my family was exceedingly intellectual, and cooking had no value. So writing books, that had a lot of value for me. Speaking, all these things were super important, so I was incredibly nervous and egoically involved. Cooking, who cares? So because who cares? It was just like, okay, I can learn this because I'm not afraid. I think that's the right word. I'm not afraid. But if I got to lose, I'll just learn. So forever after, I was Swami's hostess for a number of years. I coached for him, blah, 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 like that. So somewhere in all of that, I was saying, I just behaved as if. Because when we begin to, I was saying I had a way to serve. I started serving in that kitchen 3 meals a day, 6 days a week. On the 7th day, I loaded everybody's laundry into this big truck, and I drove it into town, and then I got all the groceries, and I brought them all back. And in the wintertime, at first we didn't even have a truck with 4-wheel drive, and the truck would fall into the ditch halfway up the hill, and then we'd have to carry everything. I loved it. It was just wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. For the first time in my life, I was doing something that mattered. But because I had the nerve to do that, all the other cobwebs began to move away. Finding your spiritual path is walking. Begin. Just begin. Don't say, I'll begin when I'm sure. Begin when you're sure enough. Don't be a fool. Don't get yourself involved in something that doesn't make any sense. But listen to your heart. Feel it. And be open. What have I got to lose? I can learn something new here. Use your common sense. Common sense is very important. But your spiritual path is your life. It's just a whether or not you're paying attention and actually doing it. It's not separate from your life. It's every single minute, every decision, every action. Everything that you do is either moving you closer to the light, or is moving you into shadow. Now bear in mind, people talk about light and dark, but it's not light and dark, it's light and shadow. Yogananda has this marvelous poem called Samadhi about cosmic consciousness. Banish the veils of light and shade, he calls it there, which is the same as shadow. The wonderful word about shadow is you cannot have a shadow unless you have light. And all you have to do to eliminate a shadow is just stop blocking the light. That's how we have to think about ourselves. Don't be at war with yourself. Just realize, well, some of my decisions haven't been the best, but it seemed like a good idea at the time, or else I never would have done it. So now just every day, every time you have a choice, every time you offer prayer, how can I serve? How can I love? How can I leave my fears behind me and to realize my true self? Okay?